Welcome. This is a wonderful turnout. Thank you so much for coming. I am delighted to welcome everyone and extend a special welcome to those of you who are new to the Urban Democracy Lab and to Gallatin. I am Alejandro Velasco. I'm a professor here at Gallatin. I teach Latin American Studies, Urban Politics, and I am extremely honored this semester to be interim director of the Urban Democracy Lab while its actual director is on sabbatical, Gianpaolo Bagchee. Let me tell you a little bit about the UDL and also about Gallatin and about our event, and then I will introduce the speakers and get our show going. The Urban Democracy Lab promotes critical, creative, just, and sustainable forms of urbanism, primarily through novel forms of practice-based research. We believe that universities can play a critical civic role in promoting social justice scholarship, curricular activities, public engagement, and programming. At the same time, we believe that truly engaging in the world in this way fundamentally changes how we conceive of scholarship, curriculum, and programming. If you're interested in following us, please join our mailing list via our website, which is urbandemos.nyu.edu. It's not up there, but there you go. We have a number of events coming up this month, not least of which is the annual Big Walk. This year's theme is the Big Queer Walk in celebration or commemoration of the 50th anniversary of the Stonewall riots. And our very own Louise Hartman, who you'll meet in a moment, is our expert steward in that affair. The Gallatin School of Individualized Study is the smallest school at NYU, but it is also the mightiest. Guided by the philosophy that self-directed learning is the key goal, our faculty, administrators, and students cultivate an environment supportive of intellectual exploration across traditional academic disciplines and beyond the university's walls. Indeed, Gallatin was once known as the University Without Walls, and we at the Urban Democracy Lab, in particular, like to think of ourselves as descendants of that legacy. I would like to issue some thanks. First, our thanks to Rebecca Amato, our tireless Associate Director at the UDL, to Monica Duncan and G. DeSocio, Teresa Anderson, Mike West, Sarah Aita, and Dean Suzanne Wofford for their support and for their logistical assistance. We also want to thank our partners in this evening's event, Archtober, which is a month-long series of events around design, politics, and architecture. You can find pamphlets outside with additional events listed, and the United Nations Habitat, UN Habitat's Urban October programming. And of course, we want to thank our speakers, who I will invite to come up now, and I will introduce you in turn. So please come on up. They are Jermaine Barnes, Nandini Bagchee, Nicholas Korody, Philip DeCourt, and our very own Louise Hartman. So let's give them a round of applause. Now. And it'll be my pleasure to introduce them in turn. Louise Hartman is Associate Professor at NYU Gallatin, and she teaches graduate courses in urban design at the Wagner School, where she is an associated faculty member. She is the founder and principal of Louise Hartman Projects, a firm that focuses on architectural design and doing research and design research and urban design. Before founding Projects, she was a principal for 20 years in the architecture and design firm Specht Hartman, which received multiple honor awards from the American Institute of Architects. The firm's designs were featured at the Museum of Modern Art, the Municipal Art Society, the Van Allen Institute, and in gallery shows in the US and UK. Nandini Bagchee is an associate professor at the Spitzer School of Architecture at CCNY, CUNY, and principal of Bagchee Architects. Her research focuses on activism in architecture and the ways in which ground-up collaborative building practices provide an alternative medium for the creation of public space. Nandini is the author of a recently published book on the history of activist-run spaces in New York City entitled Counter-Institution, Activist Estates of the Lower East Side from Fordham University Press. and she will be discussing it tonight, we hope. Nicholas Korody is editor-in-chief of Ed Magazine, a publication of Archinect, and co-founder with Joanna Kloppenburg of Adjustments Agency, and, quote, Architecture of Architecture Studio, end quote, that analyzes and tries to redesign the structures in which architecture operates. He's also co-founder of the research-based art collective Encyclopedia Inc. He's written widely about architecture, real estate, the financialization of everything, suburbanization, Airbnb, and drone warfare. Wow. Okay, among many other topics. He must be great at dinner conversation. He's also exhibited and curated artwork in Zurich, Stockholm, London, LA, and of course, New York. Jermaine Barnes received a Bachelor of Science in Architecture from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and a Master of Architecture from Woodbury University. Currently, he's a designer in residence for the Opa-locka Community Development Corporation and a senior lecturer in the School of Architecture at the University of Miami. His design and research contributions have been published and exhibited in several international publications and institutions, most notably the Graham Foundation for Advanced Studies in the Fine Arts, the Swiss Institute Design Miami, and Curbed.com, where he was named a member of the 2015 class of Young Guns. Okay, good for you. And finally, Philip DeCourt is currently the Deputy Director of UN Habitat's New York Liaison Office. Previously, he was a Chief Technical Advisor and the focal point of UN Habitat's crisis-related work in New York. He played a key role in developing an urban track towards the World Humanitarian Summit and the emerging Global Alliance for Urban Crises. During his career, Philip has predominantly focused on urban initiatives in conflict and crisis-affected countries, specializing in urban initiatives, in urban planning, land, and housing issues. He's worked for UN Habitat for more than 15 years in different capacities, including both long-term assignments in Haiti, the occupied Palestinian territories, Somalia, and Morocco. And he's also acted as coordinator of UN Habitat's Global Disaster Management Program. He was trained as a civil engineer, architect, and urban regional planner with advanced master's degrees from the University of Ghent and from Leuven in Belgium. So we are just honored tremendously for this wealth of expertise and engagement, and we look forward to a wonderful conversation. I'll leave it now to Louise. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Alejandro, and thank you all for being here to have, I think, what's going to be a really interesting evening and conversation. And I think it starts with naming. We are rebel architecture. This came across my inbox like so many things do, and it immediately, like, I perked up. Becky sent this to me over the summer, and I said, yes, whatever it was, that's what we need to be doing, rebel architecture right now. So yeah, what's in a name, right? Architecture. Architecture's a noun. It's an academic discipline. It's a licensed profession. People who graduate with degrees in architecture can become licensed architects. Architect is a protected term. It's a term of art, meaning that only licensed professionals are authorized to use the title architect. Oh yeah? I think we're going to see a number of situations and practices tonight that will open our mind to say that architecture as a self-referential discipline has moved. New York State and all the other states' credentialing organizations have a conversation among themselves, and yet the profession has moved. We are beyond the limits of definitions. Historians claim that Goebbels was the architect of the Nazi propaganda machine. Politicians style themselves as the architects of financial reform. What about IT people? They specialize in software architecture. If they have to solve a business-to-business problem, they use enterprise application architecture. Scholars write about the architecture of aggression, which is, in case you're wondering, references both neurogenetics and a song by the heavy metal band Megadeth. not in the same article. And what about the migration from noun to verb? How do I architect transitive verb and immersive experience in VR? So I introduced this to say that we have an entire month of architecture-related events, and we're either Archtober, kind of like October, Archtober, or Archtober, because we are arch and knowing. I think we are probably both, in the sense that rebel. Are we noun rebels? Are we adjectival rebels, rebel architecture, or are we verbs? We are here to rebel. And with that, I'll introduce our first speaker. Nandini Bagchee is first on deck.
We're going to hear from Jermaine Barnes first. My goof.
Thank you, Rebecca, for having me. Got an email from you during the summer as well. I'd never actually been to NYU, so of course I said, awesome, I'll definitely come. Thank you, NYU, for hosting me. When I got the brief about sort of dismantling systems, I wanted to tailor my presentation to two of the projects that have given me sort of the most internal reward. And so one of those is the work that I've done in a small city called Opelika, Florida. And then most recently, the research I've done through my Graham Foundation grant regarding the porch and its role in Black communities across the United States of America. So I titled the presentation, Don't Save Them, Architectural Heroes, specifically because I find that we as architects have a do-gooder savior complex that we want to go into a lot of communities and sort of tell them what we know and then impart our knowledge on these suspecting victims and then go forward from there. So we'll see if we can get this thing going. So Made in Opelika is a project that started in 2013, about 4 months after I finished my graduate thesis. And it was a proposal from two professors of mine in graduate school and myself, where we were tasked with proposing a way to revitalize a neighborhood using art and architecture. And the specific item that made our pitch unique was that I would move to the neighborhood where we were doing the project, essentially saying that how can we help an area if none of us live there? How can we find out what a community really needs if we're doing this from the other side of the country in Los Angeles? So this is a map of Miami, and at the very top, you'll see, I think this thing doesn't work. There we go. That is the city of Opelika. So when people see Miami, they see South Beach, they see Coral Gables, they see Wynwood Arts District, they see the Miami Heat. They very rarely see up here. And what's interesting about Opelika is that it is a historically Black neighborhood within Miami. It is just as old as Coral Gables and Miami Beach. And similarly to those other two cities, it is also a themed city in that it is the largest collection of Moorish revival architecture in the Western Hemisphere. And if you think about that, you think about something that's sort of dystopic in nature, if you go to the area where you see these ruins of domes and minarets. And so we were tasked with coming to this area and figuring out how can we use our architectural agency to help a neighborhood. And so we proposed these glitz and glamour projects like a space for performance and a space for planning, just to find out when I moved there that none of the citizens wanted any of the stuff that we proposed. So as an architect, you have to be very quick to humble yourself to understand that I don't know everything. And this is a scenario where the residents of the community know drastically more than I do. So again, dismantling these systems of sort of the architectural savior. So our idea was to provide community sustainability, social sustainability, and financial sustainability. And so there's two locations of the projects within Opelika. One area is called the Triangle, which is here, and downtown, which we call the campus. Here's a picture of the historic City Hall to give you an idea of that Moorish architecture that's there. Some more examples here. This is actually the office where we work out of, the Opelika Community Development Corporation. These are historic firehouses. So if you can imagine moving from Chicago to LA to this very small town of Opelika, where it seems like you're dropped into the middle of a Disney movie. It's a drastic change, right? There's Alibaba Avenue, Purvis, Aladdin Street, Shahrazad. It just didn't seem real. But then you move here and you see like this is a real place. And at one point in time, it had the largest murder rate in the entire United States of America. So again, bright-eyed college student moved from sunny Los Angeles to Deathville, right? Like that's what I decided I wanted to do. These are some pictures to give you an idea of the character of the area. If you've been to Miami, you understand there's a lot of electric colors that you'll find throughout the city in a lot of these black neighborhoods. Pink is very important in a lot of these areas, pink and purple. Places that if you're from Chicago like me, that's blasphemy to make your house these colors. This is the triangle. So it's called the triangle. Obviously, it looks like a triangle. But at one point, I told you guys before that it had the largest murder rate in the entire United States. In order to curb this, the system that were in place decided to put barricades at the end of the streets, as you see pictured here, to block people inside of the area. Essentially saying that if there's a high-speed chase and we drive behind you, there's one way in or one way out. So this was a systematic barrier that was placed on people who live in this neighborhood. And they asked us to come and try to help fix it. So this image here should give you an idea of what the neighborhood is like. So barbecue stand, church, another church, another church, another church, another church, another church. I mean, you get where I'm going with this. There's a lot of churches in the neighborhood. There's 115 structures. 15% of those are religious institutions. So another system that is often not talked about within architecture is the religious infrastructure that exists in a lot of these communities of color. And then how do you navigate that system? How do you navigate the pastor and the congregation that controls half the neighborhood because they own a lot of the properties that are there and are at odds with other congregations that own other parcels in the area? And so it becomes this duality of dependence on faith, which a lot of people of color and poor communities depend on because of infrastructural challenges that they deal with and that we deal with on a regular basis. But then what happens when those systems are manipulated? And then how do you design within those frameworks? And so the first thing that I was able to accomplish within the city in the Pacific, the Triangle, was a park. And that's because when we had the community meetings and we talked with children and parents, the first thing they said is, we don't want your space for planning. I don't even know what that means. We just want a park. We just want somewhere for our kids to play because we don't have that currently in our neighborhood. And so the first task was to find some open lots and then try to build a park. So this is where the Rebel Park comes in. So of this drawing, there's 4 parcels. 1, 2, 3, 4. We were only able to gain control of this one. I don't know who owns these other 3 parcels. Don't care either. So when we did this park, the idea was that if they got a problem, they can find us. I live in a neighborhood, I live down the street, 15037 Duval Street. Come knock on my door, we'll have a conversation. In the interim, we're gonna build this park because this is what people in the community said they want. They're helping, they're the ones that provided the infrastructure to make it happen, so let's do it. And so this was the empty lot that was there. These were vacant buildings that were in the area as well. And so through a Kaboom grant to get the actual play structure, and then through various channels of donations and whatnot, we were able to build this full comprehensive park in the neighborhood with the help of over 300 volunteers. And this process happened in 3 days. And the first 2 days was me and 3 people. So all these palm gardens you guys see, that was me, the community activists, and a couple drug dealers building those. You're laughing, but that's the truth. And I've never worked that hard in my life because in Chicago, we don't have palm trees. And nobody told me how you plant palm trees. I thought they were small little seedlings. You just plant, right, and then you walk away. They come full size already. And like you drop these things, you have a large piece of machinery that drops them in, and you have to use these structural components here to build them up, and that's how they stay. So I'm literally teaching drug dealers in the neighborhood how to cut on a bandsaw so we can get this stuff built in the area. But that's because they're the ones that ask for these things, and their kids ask for them. So we were trying to flip the narrative by empowering the people in the area and giving them a voice, and then not taking the role of the architect that cares, that knows more, but the architect that actually designs for the user. So this is the park when it's finished. It's a pretty cool park. The people that live in the area actually care for the park. If you Google Opa-locka, you'll find that it's always in financial turmoil. So it's pretty hard to actually use city infrastructure to care for these things. So the people in the neighborhood that help build it are actually the ones that take care of it and make sure it stays pristine. This is kids playing. Remember the building I showed you guys before that was empty? We drew a mural on it. I don't know who owns the building. Again, don't care. It's better to ask for forgiveness than permission, is what I was taught. So I'm going to go ahead and go with that. And I feel like I have enough charisma to get away with a lot of things. So it's kind of just the way that these things go. This is the Thrive campus. So after we did the park, once you do one thing in a neighborhood that works well, they want more. They want a lot more, and they want it faster than the first time you gave it to them. So now, after we give in the park, the idea becomes, what else comprehensively can you provide that helps change the generational disenfranchisement in this area? And so part of that became arts education, financial literacy, economic literacy. And so these structures you see are there in place because Opa-locka is also a food desert. So this shipping container market is going to be the future site of a commercial kitchen so that people in Miami, Florida, in this area can use the commercial space and then upscale their businesses. This is an urban farm where they'll be able to source the food for their businesses. This is the Arts and Recreation Center where we actually found a New York artist, Lake and J-Fu, who did the mural on the outside. He has an exhibition up in the Center for Architecture, the hip-hop architecture thing. And then there's a couple historic buildings that we use, and there's an arts charter school inside of there. And then my most fun project, so let me take just a quick pause. All right, when you're doing community design, nobody tells you that a lot of times you're going to sacrifice beauty and aesthetics, okay? Because a lot of times when you're doing this kind of work, it's not about you and the architect who's going to design really beautiful things. Sometimes it's just a park, right? So every now and then, I try to ask the CEO to dangle a carrot in front of me, like, what am I going to design that's going to make me happy? And so this dance academy is my fun project that I get to design inside of an old veteran of foreign war building that's in downtown Opa-locka. And so this is the first level, dance floor, seating that I was able to have a bit of fun with. This is currently in the construction document phase. This is what it's like from the second floor. Right, and axonometry to give you an idea of what the space will actually look like. So we've been fortunate enough to get a lot of funding to do a lot of these things. This is a nonprofit that I work with, which is pretty cool. And so this is the that's going to be the container marketplace that's there, right? So we're going to zoom through at this point. That's the farm. But you guys see, this is actually fully grown now. Ta-da. That's Harriet Winslow from Family Matters. She comes to our spot sometimes. This is actually a streetscape by Walter Hood out of Oakland, who did this in congruence with the rest of the projects that are there. And then we jump to Shaker Stoops. This is going to be super fast. I got like 45 seconds to pull this off. So let's just do this. All right. So the Grant Foundation grant is about telling the stories of people who are often misheard or not heard at all. And so how do we use infrastructure and how do we use our voices to tell these stories? As a black person growing up in Chicago, the porch has always been really important to us. I was arrested off of my porch, mistaken identity. And so like that's the place where you hung out, you watched cars ride past, you pointed out things. It was surveillance, it was community, it was performance, and that's why it's so important to a lot of these communities. So this is to give you an idea of porches across the country. I've been tasked with going to 5 cities, DC, Detroit, Chicago, Atlanta, and Houston, and looking at porches across and telling the stories of people that live there. This is old porches in Chicago of kitchenettes. This is one of the greatest porches ever. This is Friday, right? The whole movie happens on the porch, which is super important, right? They sell drugs on the porch. They hang out on the porch. They barter on the porch. They dance on the porch. They lift the weights on the porch. The porch is super important. And it's one of the most iconic features in American architecture. And its stories from a black perspective is very rarely heard. Anatomy of a porch. And so with this, I did an installation where I used scaffolding and then chairs sourced from black communities across Miami, and then created interior porches this past weekend. So I'm running on like 3 hours of sleep. This is the axonometric of what it was. And the interior orbs are exercise balls that we typically sit on. I wrap them in a pink plastic because if you grew up in a black family or Latino family, you can't sit on the good furniture, right? It's wrapped in plastic. This doesn't happen. So I put these things inside these areas, create these corridors to tell people, you can't touch that. Sit on the porch instead. So that's the second structure, right? You're seeing the scaffolding coming up, the one single orb that's there. And you see people sitting out here on the porch looking out. And it was wildly successful. There's way more pictures that I wasn't able to include because, again, this just ended the day before yesterday. However, it was able to create the feeling that I wanted it to create, which is that this is a very serene environment. It's a place for community. It's a place for gathering. It's a place for contemplation. And so any way that I can, or people who have my voice, are able to insert these stories and narratives in an infrastructure that often neglects them, then I assume that I've done my job as a rebel dismantling architectural systems. Thank you.
Thank you, Jermaine. We're going to hear from Nandini now. Thank you.
So thank you, Rebecca, for inviting me to this forum. I first thought I was going to speak about my book, which just came out this summer, but then I decided, looking at the title of the talk, to include some of my design work as well as work that I've done with students at City College where I teach. And so hopefully this will provide us with fodder for the discussion that follows. And I looked at the title, and this is what I did to it. I said, Rebel Architecture, Building Common Ground. The second part about dismantling power, I'm not quite there yet. So in recent years, the importance of public space has re-entered collective imagination. The space of appearance, a phrase coined by Hannah Arendt, describes the importance of a visible public sphere where bold deeds and democratic opposition is staged. This position holds open space in high regard and prioritizes parks, squares, streets. However, there is another kind of space, one where public participation is negotiated, coordinated, and developed into propositions for political action. One such place in New York City, an architectural eyesore and an unlikely candidate for urban glory, was this 3-story office building situated in downtown Manhattan. This is very close to where we are at this moment. So in imagining a place capable of nurturing radicals, one seldom thinks of an office building with desks, computers, and general clutter. However, such well-worn interiors have nonetheless served as a forum for political mobilization for generations. In 1969, the War Resisters League, an anti-war organization, bought this building and converted it for a very small sum of money into office spaces for peace and social justice tenants. Nicknamed the Peace Pentagon, this beloved building became the unofficial headquarters of the peace and justice movement in New York City. In 2009, an impending MTA project underneath the building led to the revelation of a structural problem. one that would require a substantial sum of money to remediate. As the owners of the building considered sale and relocation, a group of us got together to find ways to save the building. Peace Pentagon, a call to action and architectural competition, was launched in September in 2009 to create a dialogue with an extended community of practitioners. The brief asked participants to envision a future for this building that would accommodate the tenants, optimize resources, and raise awareness about the mission of its users. We received over 100 entries, and several of those chose to keep a portion of the old building intact as a memory, reorganizing the interior offices and repurposing the outer shell in new ways. In order to publicize the project and bring attention to the building, we curated an exhibition and installed it in several public locations. This included a branch library, a bookstore, and a collectively run art gallery. So, in negotiating the venues for this exhibition within the neighborhood, I began cataloging an inventory of similar sympathetic sites within the larger area of the Lower East Side. My book, Counter-Institution: Activist Estates of the Lower East Side, grew out of this effort to examine and memorialize the ways in which people have used buildings to leverage their cause. The activist estates in this title refers to a conceptual and literal struggle to create a space for civic action in a city built on real estate speculation. So radical movements have historically formed a bulwark against the recurring cycles of real estate speculation. An economic downturn in the 1970s led to large-scale abandonment, disinvestment, and demolition, and turned once vibrant neighborhoods into veritable ghost towns. The worsening conditions within the neighborhood, such as South Bronx, Harlem, and the Lower East Side, disproportionately impacted the poorer minority populations. In this case, the Puerto Ricans that had migrated to this part of the city in the previous decades. The multiple crises of unemployment, housing, education unfolding in these neighborhoods transformed many residents into activists and generated new forms of political agency, particularly among young Puerto Ricans. One such group to emerge from this dire situation was a Puerto Rican youth collective called Charas. In 1968, they met the architect provocateur, Buckminster Fuller, at a lecture and enlisted his enthusiastic support to build geodesic domes as a new housing prototype in the Lower East Side. On a more pragmatic front, residents organized to take over abandoned and vacant city-owned buildings and convert them into cooperatively owned housing. Urban homesteading, as this process came to be known, was recognized as a legitimate way to rehabilitate housing in several cities across the country facing similar crises at that time. In the late 70s, this movement expanded to explore the use of renewable energy as a means to achieve greater self-sufficiency. Recycling, gardening, and seeking alternatives to energy was the true goal of what came to be known as the alternative technology movement in Loisaida. A multi-generational and multi-ethnic endeavor, the homesteads and gardens in Loisaida represent an example of how bottom-up organizing could be the way to create what social theorist Murray Bookchin advocated as a libertarian municipal society. This map shows the collection of community-controlled properties that became a part of this process, and emblematic of the chaos of collective commoning practices in the city. So, in the late 80s, as capital began to flow back into the city, the once abandoned and neglected sites that had been transformed into a productive urban landscape were increasingly coveted by those with speculative interests. So whereas the 70s had been about actually rescuing these properties, the 80s was about maintaining them within community control. Urban scholars and historians view the flow of educated white artists, galleries, clubs, and new cultural institutions into formerly poor and working class neighborhoods as a contributing factor, if not a direct cause of gentrification. In the case of Lower East Side, the influx of artists, anarchists, and radicals were seen by some locals as a potential ally in their struggle against the City Developer Coalition. In 1985, Char sponsored a large-scale mural in the community garden known as La Plaza Cultural. Dispossession, revolution, and the community were united in an array of global political murals. Blackish bands with white letters read La Lucha Continua, the struggle continues. So moving from this provocative project in La Plaza Cultural in 1985 to the South Bronx in 2015, the struggle continues against gentrification for community-controlled spaces. The alarming orange of the South Bronx, so well connected to Manhattan, is, as an article in The Real Deal suggests, the most buzzed-about borough for development. This type of frontier mentality, so embedded in the American real estate psyche, overlooks the history as well as the present and continues to view territory as a tabula rasa to be developed for maximum profit. What are the alternatives? In 2016, a coalition of residents and organizations united to form the Mott Haven Port Morris Community Land Trust. Local activists see the land trust as a model of community stewardship and a means to ensure that gardens, housing, cultural, and other nonprofit places continue to thrive in this largely low and median income neighborhood. As a pilot project for the Community Land Trust, they have set their sights on the vacant Lincoln Detox Center in the heart of the Mott Haven neighborhood. They want to adapt this 3-story building into a central hub that would provide workrooms, shared meeting event spaces, and performance spaces. A social center owned by the community would provide much needed space to an existing network of organizations with a tripart agenda to support health, education, and arts, hence the Hearts Community Center. In their bid to reclaim the facility as a place for local organizations and to envision future possibilities, the Mott Haven Port Morris CLT collaborated with me and a group of my students at City College. The students' involvement had 2 purposes. First, to map out the stakeholders' needs, and second, to use design to explore the opportunities that this building provided to the community. To get to this dual agenda, the design studio combined methods of traditional research, such as site and building analysis, with more experimental workshops crafted to engage residents, organizers, and students in planning the future community center. The work emphasized one overlooked but nevertheless challenging aspect of architectural design practice, learning to listen and collaborate without losing the sense of agency that design affords. The direct access to the future users provided the students with an opportunity to experience and craft a process with regular feedback from the clients. So rather than try and dissolve the contradictions, we discussed of ways to collectively address the larger goals of the Hearts Community Center by engaging with the differences. Designing the design process itself was more important than designing the artifact. This event-based research became a strategy to advocate for community control over the building. In the fall of 2017, South Bronx Unite, one of the main organizations within the Community Land Trust, put together a team to investigate the feasibility of adapting the building into the Hearts Community Center. This study was put together by me and my team, Bagchee Architects, and it brings together the work of several consultants to create a report that looks at the use, occupancy, and financial viability of the project. The report is long, and it is an amalgamation of the processes that have occurred around this project to date, and includes the work of many different individuals and agents, and looks at the Hearts Community Center as a resource for the future. So it includes the charts and information gathered by the City College students in the earlier envisioning sessions. It also includes more traditional, site analysis. So the building is located on a very special block surrounded by parks and public spaces. The Hearts Community Center will capitalize on this infrastructure, connecting the outside, creating a porosity between the front and the back of the building. After much paperwork and phone calls, the city allowed us access to the interior of the building. Despite the deteriorated surfaces, we determined, with the help of engineers and a remediation consultant, that the building is in fact physically sound. South Bronx Unite also hired a local programming consultant who has interviewed several future tenants, the community-based organizations, as well as a potential anchor tenant that will provide and ensure the future sustainable running of the building. Based on this, we did a programming and analysis and a breakdown of existing spaces to figure out how the center might work, generating a mix of shared and separate workspaces. This building section shows some of the key spaces that we're working on to design within the building. The green, blue, and orange spaces represent the tripartite health, education, and arts agenda set by the Community Land Trust organization. Flexibility and interaction between the users is an important principle of the design. A new double-height theater at the back of the building is something that everyone is excited about. Over 150 children participate in a free orchestral music training program set up by Upbeat New York City. They have so far managed to find spaces in libraries and neighborhood churches. So this is another function of the churches that was mentioned before. They also have for years functioned as places where you could organize other types of activities besides the religious ones. And so as these spaces disappear in the city, they hope to have access to their own community theater. In the summer of 2018, we completed the first phase of our study and presented our work to residents with an interactive come-apart model at a summer festival outside the building. We are still involved in this effort, and exchanges with various city officials and potential funding partners lead us all to be optimistic about the outcomes of this endeavor. Thank you.
Thank you, Nandini. Nicholas Korody is who we're going to hear from next.
All right, this is going to be a little different because I'm not a designer, I'm a writer. And this kind of sketches out a context which maybe we could resist, but it's not really identifying forms of resistance per se. So I'm going to discuss some recent research into the semantic politics of the subprime mortgage crisis in the United States. In general, my research focuses on the domestic environments of lowercase architecture, so to speak, or the architecture that you and I and most people inhabit. Or rather, I'm interested in the architecture of this architecture, the forces that shape and determine domestic life in the contemporary era, and which are often invisible or at least don't necessarily produce identifiable architectural forms. And I believe the subprime mortgage crisis is precisely one of these. So, location, location, position reads the tagline for propertysex.com, a company founded in July 2015 that claims to put the home in homemade porn and ranks as the 8th most popular channel on the porn aggregate site Pornhub. Their website features a wide array of heterosexual pornographic videos in which various social relations of contemporary property ownership and their attendant power dynamics are played out. In many, female tenants avoid eviction by having sex with their male landlords. Sometimes female real estate agents are sexualized, while other times it is the potential buyer or tenant. If domestic porn was already an expansive genre, notably featuring the eroticization of domestic labor, such as with maid fetish videos, as well as familial relationships like with incest porn, the addition of such property porn signals the pornification of the real estate economy itself. The home, that is, has always been saturated with sex. What the house houses is sexuality, and what domesticity domesticates is desire. Or rather, to paraphrase Mark Wigley, the house not only operates as a mechanism of controlling sexuality, but the house itself emerges from the control of sexuality. As such, it is charged with eroticism and figures prominently in pornographic representation. But PropertySex.com suggests that today the commodification of the home and the precarity it produces, which is also to say the primary symptoms of the home's functioning within contemporary capitalism, have themselves become sexual stimuli. Sorry, I have a cold. The way the bourgeoisie fucks the proletariat, to borrow a phrase from Deleuze and Guattari, by appropriating their labor as private property and then leasing it back to them in exchange for rent, becomes a pay-per-view representation comprising 720 lines of 1280 pixels that change form 29.97 times a second, producing a barrage of photons that are refracted by the lens and cornea onto the retina and translated into neuronal signals, which activate the hypothalamus, releasing oxytocin into the bloodstream and producing a reaction in the spinal cord centers that drives a genital response. Exploitation transforms into ejaculate and is captured as profit. This pornification lives in the shadow of the subprime mortgage crisis. One of the primary plot mechanisms of PropertySex.com videos, the threat of eviction, gains legibility and potency from the wide breadth and severity of the crisis. The videos are able to garner such an expansive audience because eviction became an omnipresent reality for so many after the housing market bubble burst. That is, the subprime mortgage crisis forced some 10 million Americans, or 1 out of every 33 people, out of their homes. But even those able to hold on to their property felt its effects, as the crisis resulted in a net loss of $19.2 trillion in U.S. household wealth, with the value of real estate plummeting around 30% from 2006 to 2011. From best-selling books like The Foreclosure Survival Guide to TV shows like Bravo's Flipping Out, in which the host often flips foreclosed homes for profit, a mediatic culture emerged around weathering and capitalizing on the crisis. That this cultural production includes pornography not only points to the complexity of the effective economy of the subprime mortgage crisis and the broader recession it triggered, but also to a mutation in the meaning of domesticity itself within a rapidly changing techno-political landscape. PropertySex.com was founded in 2006, right at the peak of the housing market bubble, during a moment of major transformation in the porn industry, as people increasingly stopped purchasing and started streaming instead, thanks to improvements in digital communication technologies. These improvements figure into a larger developmental trajectory of communication technologies, also obliquely responsible for the subprime mortgage crisis. Specifically, globalized digital networks, alongside algorithmic computation and a host of other information technologies, enabled the growth of the securitization market. Securitization refers to the process by which mortgages and other forms of debt are pooled together, sold to investors, and exchanged on financial markets. It became an increasingly important financial practice over the course of the past few decades and directly enabled the proliferation of subprime mortgages or housing loans issued to a borrower with a low credit rating who would otherwise be restricted from taking on such loans. Without securitization, which displaces risk from the lender to the investor, as well as the deregulation of the housing market, subprime mortgage lending would have remained an untenable practice, and even with them, it proved to be exactly that. Internet pornography is therefore imbricated with securitization, two constituent elements of a much larger techno-political economy that is redesigning contemporary domesticity. How we live today, and even who we are, bears indelible traces of the events of the mid to late 2000s, from the recession to the emergence of social media. And yet, the forms we inhabit have remained largely the same, acting to obscure the scale of this transformation. Instead, the change at play happened within the subject, within the body. Following Christian Marazzi, the subprime mortgage crisis can be located within a broader biopolitical project that extends back to the crisis of Fordism in the 1970s, when its economic and technological foundations proved unable to produce sufficient profits amidst a sharp rise in the price of oil and other raw materials. Faced with pressure from investors, companies, alongside an amenable government, began the processes we now associate with the transition to a post-Fordist economy, including, notably, the financialization of much of the economy. That is, finance capital, or fictitious capital as Karl Marx called it, since it is a claim over wealth that is yet to be produced, was previously distinct from, yet tethered to, the real or industrial economy. With financialization, finance capital became inseparable from real capital, which is invested in industrial production and labor, and money capital, which comprises funds actually held. The wealth produced from speculative markets penetrated all modes of production, including of goods and services, enabling growth without accumulation. The future became the foundation of the present. In order for this to be maintained while keeping wages low, profits were extracted from consumption through non-wage incomes in the form of debt, primarily mortgages, which could be remortgaged in order to gain more credit in a process known as home equity extraction. Since mortgages were now able to be issued to nearly everyone, thanks to the distanciation of risk enabled by securitization, they constituted a primary source of increases in consumption in the early 21st century. Housing wealth produced through debt became a substitute for withdrawn social services. If capital commodifies labor, finance capital commodifies life itself. The devastation the subprime mortgage crisis unleashed had, accordingly, somatic dimensions. It was inscribed on the body. As early as 2008, experts were already expressing concern over the expected health ramifications of the crisis. Later, reports would verify a statistically significant deterioration in self-reported health, followed by an increase in official morbidity rates. There is a 7.2% and 8.1% rise in emergency visitations and hospitalizations for hypertension and diabetes, respectively. Psychotropic drug usage went up, specifically with antidepressants and anxiolytics. People smoked more cigarettes, toked more weed, and snorted more coke. Thousands killed themselves. Chain reactions ensued, as many people were only able to pay their medical bills by leveraging their mortgages, or entered default because they weren't able to afford medical costs. 1/3 of 90 surveyed households undergoing foreclosure between 2013 and 2014 stated they were unable to even pay for food. Such effects, like the economic toll of the crisis, were not evenly distributed. People of color were substantially more likely to default on their loans as a result of being disproportionately and often illegally targeted for subprime mortgage predation. As a result, they experienced greater health ramifications. The crisis also dramatically changed domestic behavioral patterns, both through and alongside biochemical transformation. Rates of domestic abuse rose together with cortisol levels. Birth rates declined as partnered women increasingly opted for sterilization procedures and teenagers for birth control. For the first time in 130 years, adults living in America between the ages of 18 and 34 were more likely to be living with their parents than with a spouse or partner independently. More and more people began to work from home in order to cut costs for employers, if you kept your job, or because you lost it and had to turn to the gig economy and other emerging labor markets. But that was not the only way that the home increasingly became a site of labor as a result of the recession. Broadly speaking, while the construction industry experienced market decline, the home improvement market recovered quickly from losses sustained during the crisis. Notably, a significant portion of this was derived from non-professional projects. That is, with families desperate to shore up the value of their primary asset, many turned to DIY home improvement. This was encouraged by the emergence of a robust DIY culture, surfacing everywhere from cable channels like HGTV to online platforms like Pinterest, which was launched in 2010. Today, a search for home improvement produces 1,254 results on Pornhub. Labor blurs with leisure, production with pleasure. With the expansion of credit enabled by securitization, subprime mortgage lending, and home equity extraction, The home becomes not just shelter, but also a speculative investment. According to Fiona Allen, this entails a reconfiguration of identity as we become both dweller and investor. Even our experience of time changes, and with it, our relationship to ourself. That is, finance capital seeks to possess future wealth by objectivizing it in the present, while debt is a promise of future labor. Together, as Maurizio Lazzarato explicates, these co-substantiated forces mortgage the present for the sake of a speculative future, and as a result, demand a subject who above all can be accountable for that which is precisely beyond their control, their own future. But while this calculative sobriety marks one aspect of the neoliberal or financialized subject, processes of atomization, the individual as entrepreneur or even enterprise, make further demands. That is, the neoliberal subject must always appear happy, a mandate dubbed the pleasure performance apparatus by Pierre Dardot and Christian Laval. We must not only produce more, but also enjoy more, and, pivotally, this surplus of pleasure must be performed. Pleasure serves as a signifier of the subject's value within a socioeconomic system in which self-edification is substituted for the social and responsibility is privatized. Within this context, the home becomes a primary site for the performance of pleasure, as well as a means of its representation. Domestic labor becomes at once an investment in the future, a signifier of well-being, and a means of self-expression. Nesting is investing, reports Diana Olick of CNBC. Discard anything that doesn't spark joy, advises best-selling author Marie Kondo. When visitors walk into your home, what story do they read? Asks life coach Martha Beck. In addition, our pleasure itself produces profit. As Paul Preciado details, whether through pornography or HGTV or MDMA, the subject's consumptive enjoyment generates capital. Drawn into circuits of exchange by the expansion of debt, even the barest lives serve as extraction sites as a result of their unification into a digitally connected techno-social whole. That is, a single masturbating body does little, but millions together produce an economy worth an estimated $97 billion, more than the GDP of 60% of the world's nations. The home becomes both factory and distribution center, courtesy of its newfound technological porosity. A pornified market saturates the domestic. The private is publicized as masturbatory capital. In the shadow of the subprime mortgage crisis, the domestic emerges as both site and mechanism of a transformation of the subject. Toxified bodies become willing captives of the capitalist metabolism that poisoned them, while even their molecules are mortgaged for the profit of others. Governed by the logic of finance capital and the extension of debt as a generalized condition, time itself is redesigned, as speculative futures hold dominion over the present. In turn, the subject performs pleasure in order to signify their value as an investment. But the line distinguishing the performative and the authentic blurs beyond recognizability. Actors are not aware that they are acting. Within this context, nothing, not even desire, appears able to evade the totalizing forces of marketization, with pleasure becoming both mandate and commodity. Thank you.
And finally, we'll hear from Philip DeCourt.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. And I must say now I have to give you an anticlimax by speaking about the UN. But I'm happy that I'm here because, I mean, it does speak to a lot of what I was doing before the UN. And in a way, this book that I worked on as co-editor with Andrew Rudd is a little bit of rebellion within the UN and the way we talk about urbanization architecture. The second word, the New Urban Agenda, is a political document, an agreement between 193 member states on how to get to sustainable urbanization and how to translate the concept of leaving no one behind in the Sustainable Development Goals in dealing with our cities. But also saying, look, I mean, if we want to get it right, we will have to deal with our cities and our urbanization, or we will not get there. This is what's going to happen in our cities. The fault lines are no longer north-south. urban and rural, the fault lines are also within our own cities. The book is itself a curation of about 13 papers that we kind of pulled apart disrespectfully, and apologies to if any authors are in the audience, and constructed an argument to kind of push for a different discourse, to complement this political document, kind of saying there are a number of questions that are not yet answered, that are not yet fully thought through. This is the first part on forces shaping the 21st century urbanization that require more discussion. But then also there is a need for kind of a rethinking on how we talk about planning and architecture. And there is a bit of a science to it, not an exact science, but a bit of a science that is important to put out there. It was constructed around the work of Saskia Sassen, a dialogue between Saskia Sassen, Richard Sennett, Ricky Baudet, and Juan Clos, who was the last executive director, ex-mayor of Barcelona. One of the main starting points was the realization that the Charter of Athens still had an immense impact on what is being produced today in terms of urbanization. Maybe not here in New York, but if you look at what is being done in Prussia and China, how that's being exported to Africa, it very much still reflects those same ideas. And the initial idea was to create a new manifesto. Now, very quickly we understood that that was not possible, or at least a futile attempt, or not necessary. But basically pushed for a different kind of discussion. I'm just going to take you to a couple of the quotes in the book and some of the main statements. And then the second part, I would completely take you somewhere else and talk about a personal experience I myself had in Somalia that kind of predates the book, but somehow speaks to what of some of the elements of your discussion here today. One of the key things that Saskia Sassen, of course, is putting forward in her own work is this idea that it's not just the public sector that kind of retreated, but the private sector really pushed forward and owning big parts of the city, not just the buildings, but also the spaces around it. And also kind of, in the way they're doing it, creating a fake urban, de-urbanizing cities. And this is certainly true in New York, where you have density that basically is just accumulated capital, but nobody living in it, or not being part of the city, not being part of the neighborhood. So very important statement from her side. A second, I'm not going through it systematically, a second part is this very big realization that we have a big problem. We talk in the UN about climate change, we talk about migration, some of the main challenges for our global world, but we see the opposite happening. We have this push for populism happening here, happening in other countries. And what does it mean for democracy, the way we talk about democracy? And I'm keen to hear your ideas here in the Urban Democracy Lab, and one of the articles exactly came from here. We have this, it's no longer just kind of the government and civil society. There's this whole variety of actors that actually influence what is happening and have unclear responsibilities, but also unclear legitimacy. But ultimately, they're the ones that influencing what actually is happening in a day-to-day reality. And this article that came exactly from João Paulo on planning without democracy or democracy without planning. The graphic underneath is just pointed to climate change. We lost the connection between what you do as a citizen or as a government and ultimately the impact of your actions. Climate change is the perfect example. There's no longer the connection between what you do and the risks you're losing or the risks you're putting on your own community or the loss you might face. Those things are completely disconnected. What you do here creates incredible loss and risks in places that basically have nothing to do with climate change. Speaking, of course, about a lot of the low-lying communities, Liberia, West Africa, low-lying slums that are about to submerge, but basically that's not there. They have nothing to do with it. They basically have a very low carbon footprint themselves. So a lot of arguing, of course, in the book, and to most of it is not unfamiliar to the open systems thinking and a design practice that allows cities to evolve and change. The fundamental idea that Richard Sennett is putting forward, of course, saying again, look, the whole idea of the Charter of Athens was the blueprint. This is to create order into order where disorder was. In our current practice, of course, as architects and urban designers, thinking differently about order and disorder, and having a new practice moving forward. It also involves exactly the discipline of design, which even what I practiced in the beginning, was a lot about creating very concrete and defined spaces to something that is much more fluid and that creates possibilities. Thinking about borders, zones in between, but also thinking about how specific this is a housing projects in Chile, how the initial act of the architect gets overtaken by the people that ultimately inhabit them, but give them enough space to appropriate what ultimately becomes their neighborhoods. A lot of discussion, of course, of kind of moving beyond the whole blank slate approach, the tabula rasa kind of thinking that is still very much there, but also kind of this really calls for different ways of analyzing. If you accept that there's always something there before you get there, and in the first presentation you talked about that, if you don't know that reality, and if you don't try to have different tools to kind of unpack, it's not a drawing. We very often start from a drawing that is incapable of reflecting the complexity of a space, its history, its timelines, the multiple identities that are there, and so different ways of approaching it before you actually can get to design. And this is also a very important statement and part of the book, which requires exactly an engagement as a planner or architect with a wide variety of actors, and not just communities as such, but also exactly, as you said, the powers to be sometimes these communities. It can be churches, it can be others that are out there. Talking about exactly a much more malleable incremental urbanism, making a very strong case that it's not just about the small scale, well thought through interventions, and we saw some of them in the presentations. It is also about the large scale decisions, the large scale spatial networks we put in place, and how we shape them, and how they can create opportunities for different groups, poor, rich, and others in a society to kind of create their own space and be part of the city, overcoming any inequalities in the process. Just an example of, and maybe some of you know this, Medellin in Colombia, where they basically was a whole thinking around integrative networks across connecting the formal and the informal city, the formal city below, the informal cities on the slopes, and pulling them together. That in a way was about the right to the city for whoever was on the slope. Giving them access to the city was key, and then along the way creating spaces for them to add their own community, their own kind of space for expression. Along these cable lines came up a lot of community-based spaces and infrastructure that was locally designed and thought through. The commons, a realization exactly that the fight for the public space is a very difficult one under current environment. Space has value. Creating enough public space is, and we see decline in public space globally, something what, as you inhabit, that we are trying to monitor. Decline in the amount of public space, decline in the nature of public space. Very often exactly it's part of private developments, handed back to the local governments, to the authorities, but it's not public. It's not public in nature. It's not public in the way it can be used. And so a big call exactly for, and this is some examples for really focusing also on creating the common space, which by its nature is also then something that's managed by different groups and is part of the city in a different way. But this only makes sense if it is something that is if it's strategy at scale. It's not enough to have one specific spot in the neighborhood. It needs to be a strategy at scale, and this is the argument also being made in the book. The picture above is a school in East Jerusalem in a Palestinian refugee camp. A very deliberate attempt to create a common space in an almost impossible environment where the notion of public space is almost completely absent. Very briefly about my own experience in Somalia, going back to 2005, when I exactly freshly arrived from teaching at university in this kind of environment. The picture is the kind of what you see on the left. This is Bosaso in the northeast. An environment where exactly planning and design was completely absent, rule of law was absent, and basically the actual planner was the guy driving the bulldozer. He was the one tracing the roads that ultimately defined what the plan was. And so whoever paid him and knew him had a big control over how the plan was being laid out. And this was the environment we were working in. 25% of the people in Bosaso were displaced from the south, or refugees, or migrants on their way to Yemen. And this a lot of these places would burn down every year. Half of them would burn down, and we would come in as a UN and kind of rebuild them, give people the sticks and the plastic sheeting to kind of rebuild their shelters, and we never understood what was happening. So as architects and planners became inside, we asked a fundamental question, which goes back to this kind of understanding the context. Why were people there? Why were they there in those conditions? And that was the question nobody had asked. The only question was asked was who has access to a latrine? Nobody had. Why did we have these high densities? And the answer was very, very urban, very basic. This was prime urban land that land grabbers tried to keep control of by allowing or having displaced on their lands, charging rents, and if you maximizing density means maximizing rent, not allowing anything in the ground because it will allow them to rebuild, to use their land whenever they were ready to invest. And it was basically a very simple real estate strategy that they were putting in place that ended up in these kind of conditions. Now, our strategy to, and this was a little act of rebellion to kind of deal with it, was say, look, fire is a problem for the neighbors. Fire is a problem for the neighborhood. So let's try to deal with some of these basic. You're paying rent, you should have something in return. And we made a discussion on the radios. We made a discussion in the mosques. Like how do we go about this? And we ended up doing a couple of things. One, we ended up negotiating a different kind of rental agreement between landlords, municipalities, and the kind of displaced communities. What were the basic rights if you're paying rent? And then when something would burn down, we had developed a very basic planning manual which we handed over to the communities, and we were helping them in the beginning to, and we call them fire breaks. We are going to just put in fire breaks to kind of reduce the risk, but what we were doing, of course, was trying to knit these neighborhoods together with the rest of the city, making sure that the services were kind of in between what was the informal part and the formal part, and creating some streets that immediately, this is, oops, sorry. This picture here, of course, was creating activity. If you have a street, have a corner, we're seeing immediately creation of urban, of economic activity. And we were very interested to kind of figure out also how do we set in motion something that becomes much bigger than ourselves. And ultimately, in a couple of years, exactly, these kind of neighborhoods had turned into something a bit more like this. This was fire-resistant shelters, still temporary. That was the whole idea, but done in a different way and somehow part of the community. At the same time, there was still a big push to get everybody out, to move everybody to a site, and what was given to the UN was a site 11 kilometers out of town in the desert, of course, where nobody was claiming the land that had no value, and the UN was ready to build. The UN was ready to move people because of big protection issues. Of course, people were being abused, women sexually violently. Move everybody out, let's create the ideal environment and give the land to us. As architects and planners, we said, look, this will not work. People, if you look at people's reality, their access to livelihoods, to jobs, it's in the port, it's in the market, people will come back. You will never get over the problem. So we did kind of go the high ground, and this is also part of the book. This is a political discussion. How do you get to real integration? How do you overcome these inequalities? How do you create inclusive cities? And so we made some very basic arguments on transportation, on access, on social integration, on infrastructure costs, making a very economic argument. Even the local population didn't have a lot of access to services. On economic integration, if you move your people working in your port out of town, well, they will not show up to work. So you will have a big problem in terms of just your own economic end. And pushing for a real kind of thinking big scale in terms of sustainable growth in Bosasa, what it meant. And it meant moving exactly in a completely different direction than the way the city has grown until then. And we did a very basic kind of negotiated planning with that group of people, deputy mayor, the water engineer, and basically laid out, and this is a very rudimentary drawing that we were making with them, a basic grid, and then carving out whatever we thought was important for the common good and the public good. So we didn't bother exactly on who controlled what. We did not want to get into who owned what, who controlled what. We made the argument, look, if you're able to give us some land, well, you need to give us some land, we will develop the area. We will plan the area. Real estate values will go up, but in return, we need to extract for the public good and the common good. It included public spaces, but it also included exactly spaces for the displaced. And what we saw that ultimately was a whole new dynamic of actually, for the first time, displaced being able to buy land in this area, coming to us with a paper that said, look, we went to the municipality, we are paying taxes. And ultimately, then we were providing them with shelter, kind of very basic shelter support, but very rudimentary. Some ideas, but basically the papers were their rights being secured in an area which was much more sustainable and which ultimately became a process beyond our own capacity as the UN in that environment. So, a side story, but the book exactly is meant to kind of push for different kind of debates, and I'm happy to listen to more of you. Thanks.
Hey, thank you, Philip. Thank you, all of you. As moderator, I think I might start with a couple of questions that I've come and then go to the audience for questions too. Is that time-wise make sense? One of the things I think that has just intrigued me as the presentations, which are so fascinating, and you're giving us a glimpse into this very deep set of issues and concerns that is expertise, is the question of scale. So maybe we're at the scale of the home, and all, as Nicholas suggests, that is embodied in the American ideal of the single family house or the home. And then we come up to the question of town and city and landscape and scale, population, displaced populations. And then I kind of come to where we are. We are the largest university in North America. We're at the university. So I would ask this question of power. And all of us have different university affiliations over time. And again, for those of you who may not know these kind of heroes, don't save them, in the planning world, Richard Sennett is one of our university professors here at NYU, a colleague and someone I'm pleased to call a friend and supporter. His wife, Saskia Sasson, a planning historian who teaches at Columbia. Ricky Burdett, who is one of our signature university professors after he and his team master planned the London 2012 Olympics. So again, the university is implicated in this power structure in so many different ways. Your own university, who sets up an architectural project to say, oh, they need thus and such, and then you show up and say, actually, that's not what we need at all. We just didn't, you didn't ask the right questions, right? City College, so you're having a continuing relationship with some of your students, and yet they graduate, so it's actually the faculty often who are providing continuity. Nicholas, yourself with your design work and your research, again, is that coming out of a university or other kind of power structure? So I guess my question too is that, are we following the money? Are we independent agents? How far do you think we can push the power that enables us to do our work? Are we in any way bumping up against our own internal structural regulations, not just the limitations of capitalism on steroids? Or Nicholas, I think you're right to bring that up. The 8th most popular site on Pornhub, I actually looked up the size of the pornography industry as compared to the video game industry. Porn, 97 billion, video game industry, 99. That's going to see a convergence too, has already. So I just think that there are all these latent and very explicit power structures within which we operate, and I just thought maybe you might germane at the idea of the university kind of fail process, but then maybe if you don't mind picking up after that, Philip, about what's the role of a university or the United Nations, a large organization coming in to do this kind of work.
So I guess I'll try to be brief, and there's sort of two ways it can be addressed. One from the perspective of a professor in a school of architecture that does projects in communities like Opalaka to give access to my students to see areas they otherwise wouldn't have access to or otherwise wouldn't want to interrogate. because if they come to Miami, they have no desire to go to these arenas. And so I think one of the ways that we break down those barriers is clearly just by giving access and just, again, providing exposure. So I think that's one. But one of the things I try to tell my students is the second part is that as an architect or architecture designer or whatever word we want to use, given AIA, NCARB, whatever standards they want to address, one of the best ways to do that is actually through policy, not actually through building something. So when I moved to Opa-locka, I'm actually on the City of Opa-locka's Planning and Zoning Board. And so when it comes to creating new modes of creation and development within the city, I'm able to help influence those guidelines. And so I try to tell my students, like, that's the best way that you can make these things happen. Exactly. If you don't like the game you're playing, just change the rules. I mean, that's what I do anyway.
Philip, a very different scale, very different set of places.
Well, I think we're in this surreal environment of the United Nations where we have these agreements, these global agreements that in itself are extremely lofty and worth pursuing. I mean, I honestly believe that. But of course, then when you hit the ground, and it was for 5.5 years in Somalia, you're dealing with warlords, you're dealing with a war economy, dealing with people that grabbed vast amounts of property. The reality is very, very, very different. And one thing I quickly realized, jumping from university, my own university career to Somalia, was that how political our role was. That we should not underestimate the political role we had, and that ultimately it was about finding strategies to kind of bring the interests from different groups together, not just focusing on one, but basically brokering something that ultimately served the common purpose, recognizing that people were pursuing different interests. And learning how to do that for me was a big shift in my own thinking, but it meant recognizing the very strong political role you had. And yes, sometimes in our case it was then zooming in on a specific rental agreement that was the key to then unlock a lot of other stuff. And that requires a bit more open thinking than just still with a very, this is the other stuff in the book, with a very strong notion that all of those global agreements, sustainable development goals, you need to see it within space. If you don't see the spatial dimension to it, you're not going to be able to actually make a difference and make progress. It does land somewhere. And as you said in your own presentation, you have a piece of land and multiple interests on that specific piece of land. So.
I like especially that you brought up that in Somalia you're dealing with warlords. You were very explicit who you're dealing with, the drug lords who are the guys helping you, I assume they're guys, helping you plant the palm trees. That again brings up to like the physicalization of power. Someone has power over you, so it's not just that zoning regulations are empowering or disenfranchising people. So I wondered if you, Nicholas, wanted to say something about censorship or the idea that we have this idea of net neutrality, that we can get any information that we want, that we are actually now, one of the many things I think that we are trying to understand is what is our access to information that we want to get versus access to information about ourselves, right? That I think you very eloquently and suggestively suggested about how we bring different bodily pleasures into the public sphere, but also how that's manifested, say, in the idea of a home. And Nandini, I don't know if this is an easy connection to make, but I look especially at the idea of embodiment and about the idea of not being Puerto Rican and yet being effective in a Puerto Rican community. So I was just wondering if maybe there's strategies or comments there, and then I'm going to open it up more broadly. Is that an interesting prod, or it's a stretch too far?
Well, I don't know much about censorship, to be honest. Although I guess I am very interested in what the effects are of kind of operating within a web of complicit relationships, particularly within academia or in kind of like the academic side of architectural practice, if you will, the kind of exhibitionary side. And that's something I engage with often with my research practice adjustments agency. We, for example, analyzed the relationships between the Chicago Architecture Biennial and its sponsor, British Petroleum, and also its relationship to Mayor Rahm Emanuel, who's a terrible fellow. And the project was meant to expose these relationships and kind of underline the kind of inherent hypocrisy of having this discourse about sustainable futures, but really what you're doing is you're corporate washing. You're making one of the highest polluting companies or entities, really, in the world look okay through your designs on boards. And I think that what that does is provoke like a wide range of questions, because there's no, at the same time as I'm saying that, there's no outside to this system. There's no way of like positioning yourself morally superior to this. Like, you need to get, you want to get like a move from an adjunct to an associate professor, you need to like show in these, at the Chicago Biennial. It's like, it's a certain degree of privilege to be able to just opt out of the system. What that then leads to, I think, is the question of organizing. And often, I think that's the answer to a lot of questions when it comes to how do we deal with structures of power. We have to organize and act collectively, because action done alone does very little. I don't know if that answers the question.
I think I got that. So I don't know how effective I am to the Puerto Rican community. I have a fairly long career as an architect in this city, and I am an immigrant, and I have been in many situations within more conventional architectural practices and found, myself identifying with various, marginal issues. And so, so the question of being in the powerful position of a city college professor, it's not that powerful. At the same time, so there's these ideas, but at the same time I do have a kind of privilege that working with the university allows me certain kinds of privileges into accessing certain types of information and making inroads into certain kinds of ideas and concepts, which with my students and our work together, we are able to accomplish things. So I feel each designer, since this is about the idea of design, is operating both from a position of power and disempowerment, and how you kind of leverage those two identities, let's say, allows me to work with this very special group of people who I think have adopted me. I'm sort of the in-house architect. I get strange calls about all kinds of things that people think architects do, and it's a really wonderful creative experience for me working within those parameters.
Glad to hear you talk about that, because again, NYU, and I'm going to call on you back there because you wanted to ask a question for what, but I think it's really interesting. NYU doesn't have an architecture school, and yet we have a totally standing room only event tonight about architecture. So again, I think that just contributes to my feeling that this is a moment of vitality and a sense of questioning. And I don't know that in the how-to part of how to dismantle power through design, I don't know that we're going to get the how-to answers tonight, but I think we've seen some examples of that. But I'd also just like to say about this kind of question about power, and I always think about power and money together. As a university professor, we decide, we set the questions that our students are going to pursue with us for the semester. The students pay tuition to that university, and then they select this or that professor to work with. So we have an incredible sense of power and I think responsibility. And again, I think we've heard of two examples again, where I think that sounds like it's being cared for and valued, both within the university and within the communities. But I also have to say, to Nicholas's point, and again, Philippe, I would love you to say more, the big corporations and the big banks are way in bed with this. Deutsche Bank, the only bank that will finance Donald Trump and his various real estate proposals is as a major funder of Urban Age, a major set of urban design conferences and books. And yet, how do we interrogate that? Where do we interrogate that? Are we biting the hand that feeds us? Was anybody else going to pay for that? You had to go to Kickstarter or something else to raise money for the playscape. Does that happen in academia now where and I think you're absolutely right to criticize BP. It's like, what are the other venues? Is there a parallel or an alternate? Where's that sites of resistance? So I'll put that out there and we can talk about our funding sources. But please, there's a question in the back. So how do we work this? We have a microphone. Great. Why don't you give your name and ask your question?
Hi, my name is Veena, and the question was for Jermaine. The spaces that you used for the park and the dance hall, etc., were they private spaces or did it belong to the county?
Is that the whole question?
Yeah.
Okay. They were all private spaces. So the park, we were able to get one of the 4 parcels donated from the city of Opa-locka. The other 3, there's somebody's. I don't know who or what that person is, or if they even still exist. And then the ones in downtown Opa-locka, through some funding sources, we were able to acquire 2 of those parcels, and that's how we've done the rest of those things. Those are also, those were private, that the funding resources allowed us to purchase those.
Oh.
So the initial seed funding was through the National Endowment of the Arts Art Place Grant, which is a matching grant, which brought me from LA to Miami. And then the subsequent grants were Kresge Foundation, Cerner Foundation, and Art Place. And so those various resources we were able to create those projects.
You also mentioned that the community was interested in having the park, but when you went actually to do the work, it was just you and 2 other people. So if they were so excited about it, how come they didn't come and help you?
Poor people have like 17 jobs. And so when they get home from a long shift and they have children or kids, they don't really have the time or resources to come and do things. So when you have community planning meetings and zoning board meetings that are at 8 p.m. on a Tuesday night, and somebody has to choose between don't want to make dinner for my kids or don't want to come, obviously most times you don't get that sort of membership that are there. So part of my privilege as a young person without children and those kinds of things, that I have the ability to do those things and give up those times. And so that's part of the process. It's being able to step outside of yourself and do things because other people don't have the necessary infrastructure. And so that's how we were able to get those things completed. On the 3rd day, when we had the 200 volunteers, that was just a lot of the things that people didn't hurt themselves. But a lot of the heavy lifting was done the prior 2 days.
Okay.
Thank you very much. We're going to take another question in the front row here, if you don't mind. There's a gentleman, and then another one here. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. My name is Imani. My question is, I guess, more for Jermaine, but I'd like to hear from all of you. So I actually didn't grow up too far from Opa-locka. I grew up like 3 blocks right from the Walmart, real
Gotcha.
close by.
Yep,
Yeah. And so 2 questions, and I think it revolves around like money and power and sort of just like real, tangible things that we can do. And so the first one is, I remember growing up in the area and sort of like nobody really caring, and now there's this big like New York money situation that they're like sending a lot of money down there to sort of buy out these houses that used to be like crack dens or whatever the case may be, sort of like very active gentrification.
Yep.
And it's sort of like hard to fight that back even with policy because money speaks louder. And so I guess like that's my first question, like navigating that. And so like when we have like these big outside resources, especially when they come from like other states. And then the second thing is sort of like coming to the realization that you sort of have to play into the system to get around the system. And I think we can talk about like, oh, like, you know, we're privileged and this, and like you don't want to navigate, but like at the end of the day, like we have to make capital and we have to find ways to like make money, because if not, we're not going to enact any change. And so just like real ways that you guys navigate those spaces, because I find it to be just like very hard. It's like, what's ethical, what's right, like what do I feel good sort of like bending on?
And I'll be quick so somebody else can talk. I think that we all have our own standards of ethics and morality, right? And I think part of that dismantling of the current infrastructure and power structure is to be able to educate people who otherwise don't have access to the jargon or the resources that are typically used in urban planning and architecture. And so I would say a tangible thing that you can do is when they have those type of community members and community meetings that you know an aunt or somebody can't go to, if you have that information, then you show up, right? So put down the cell phone, no Instagram for 3 hours, no Snapchat, and go and do that for 45 minutes because you spend that time goofing around on Fortnite anyway. And so if you do that, then you're able to take the information back to the people who need it, and you can translate it. Because it's one thing to be in this environment and you're present. It's another thing for somebody to talk above you and not give words that are accessible to the people that are there. And so I would say challenge all of you that want to make change. And then, I mean, I can say for myself, I'm not a social activist. Like, I'm not on, you won't find me on Twitter saying, occupy something. Like, that's not my thing. But you'll find me at a community meeting saying, yeah, developer, that's not right. That's not how this works. That's not helping the neighborhood. So you have to find a way that you can make those types of changes. And the last thing quickly is the whole gentrification boogeyman thing. Technically, me moving to Opelika is gentrification, right? But I'm black, so people don't realize that. So to be able to understand that there's more nuanced ways of responsibility that goes with gentrification. And at the end of the day, like you said, money does matter. So you can educate the people in the neighborhood. You can teach them about equity. You can teach them about finance, teach them about the cost and value of their homes. But if they decide they still want to sell said home for $1, you can't stop them from wanting to get out of their economic dire situation.
We'll take the next question, but I think this is a good time to talk about the community land trust that Nandini was mentioning too. And I think, again, at a much different scale that Philip was speaking about, and maybe you guys want to jump in there about the other idea that, of course, this is embodied as like most people's most valuable asset. And yet the asset is also the neighborhood. It's also the relationships between the people. So how do we start to think about that? And maybe you want to jump in a little bit with Aloizada. And then finally, Philip, with your relationship, it was about understanding an ownership model that how do you educate people about that too? And then I'm going to go, there's a question here and then a question back here.
Yeah, I think also just to point out that despite what appears to be a rampant privatization across the country, there is still a lot of public land. And just to recognize that and to really be aware of the possibilities latent within trying to recover that sort of vast amount of properties in maybe not so much in New York City, although there is quite a bit when you really like scratch the surface. And so the community land trust is really an idea that is, we'll see how much traction it has, but it's occurring in the South Bronx, it's occurring in various different neighborhoods. The idea being that instead of, and really going after what are already city-owned properties and asking the city, hey, why don't you give us a 99-year lease? We'll develop this property and we'll create a kind of community-owned resource. So a successful example of how this worked is Cooper Square, not far from here on South 4th Street, where they fought for about 50 years. These things take time, so it's not insurgent activism. It takes time, and it involves the efforts of planners, designers, professionals, as well as community activists. So, you know, it's a kind of a joint effort, and it can be very successful. What that particular community land trust does is puts a large stock of apartment buildings into the land trust, which then remains affordable, i.e. The group of people decide how they keep the apartments and those properties, that amount of housing, in a way that avoids getting into the speculative market.
Say something a little bit about the United Nations, again, coming in, establishing what may or may not be a temporary settlement. In Somalia is a good example. Dadaab, one of our colleagues, again, did a lot of research on Dadaab as well.
I think we, in the book, there's also an article on, and this speaks to my own profession as a planner, that cities, it takes decades to kind of turn cities around and move them forward and have transformative change. And at the same time, you're dealing with this very hard issues on the humanitarian side of the UN of saving lives and doing something today. And so in the work we do, you do have that ability to kind of try to create an arc across that, and kind of start thinking, if we want to arrive at a more transformative change, what are all the entry points we have? And what we found in dealing with the ownership issues in Bosaso it was about reclaiming the role of government, something that is certainly in Somalia was completely lost. Legitimacy was completely lost. It's the same here, the same elsewhere. Reclaiming a government actually stands for something. I mean that the rule of law, but also kind of upholding some principles and some values. And what we did in Somalia, which was very powerful, is rebuilding also the public discourse, making this a public issue, making this a public debate on what was right and wrong. And of course, Somalia was an Islamic society, so we really kind of said, what is right based on your own values? And then bring it back to the concrete issue of what we were trying to deal with. But also the last one was making a business case. Why this was also good for the ones that actually controlled the resources. And it's something the UN is trying to do much better also now today, is engaging the private sector, going back to the Deutsche Bank and others. It's kind of making a business case for sustainable development. Not an easy one, and not an easy debate, but changing the narrative.
And here in the front row.
My question was originally directed towards Jermaine. However, I would like to open this question up to the rest of the panel, including Philippe. The question was, when you moved from Los Angeles to Florida, how did you, or did you feel like you successfully assimilated with the culture that you moved to? I know you mentioned that you went to community board meetings to hear a lot of different inputs from other community members, but were there some other activities that you participated in that gave you all kind of good gut feelings that you were making the right decisions? Same thing with you, Philippe, when you go to Somalia, like how do you break down certain barriers and familiarize yourself with the community?
So I moved into the neighborhood, and I just walked around to every single house and took a photograph of every single house in the neighborhood. So I walked around over 3 days and took a picture of 115 houses. And when I did that, people were on their porch, people came outside, people thought I was the police, people wondered why I lived there. I told them that I'm a student living in the area, and I'm doing work on a project, and I want to try to help understand what's going on in the neighborhood. And at no point did I ever talk down to anyone, no point did I ever try to make them seem like I knew stuff they didn't know. I just wanted to listen. And the one thing I can say, if you ever want to get into this type of work, is you can't ask questions. If you ask questions, people become defensive. If you have a conversation, they'll tell you stuff. You might not realize it, but they're telling you a lot of things. And so over time, they knew me as, oh, Jermaine's at home, or they'll knock on my door, they'll see my car out front. And you just can't be afraid of that process. I mean, a lot of times people want to do work, but they don't want to get their hands dirty. Like you really do. I would assume, like if you're in Somalia, it's probably even more scary than what I'm dealing with in Opalaka.
I never tried to assimilate. But no, I had colleagues exactly going out, chewing the local cat, the local drug for hours and hours on end and trying to have a conversation. But I also, for me, it was kind of clear I would never be able to understand the way they were talking and the issues behind it. And so I was using national staff that I really trusted to exactly, I would go for the public meetings, the negotiations, and helping with the strategy, but then the actual getting into the community was done by my national, my local colleagues.
I think a lot of people probably don't know how the UN works. So when you say you could never assimilate, you mean because you're white and Western, or because there's actually people that are already on the ground there that are working for the UN that are, as you say, local representatives?
No, I think it was the multiple layers of identity. One, white, Western, money. Two, UN, more money. And so I would just distort the discussion. If I would enter a community meeting, I would just distort the discussion. It would not be an honest discussion about the issues. So for me, it was not the right way to do it.
Can I respond to that as well? So I've had a fairly long, as I mentioned before, architectural career, and the first part of it, was me waiting in my office to get commissions for the kind of work I would like to do, and in the meantime doing other types of works. And at some point, having taught for a couple of years and being engaged in kind of more research-based work and studying the history of social movements in the Lower East Side, all these gave me sort of the ammunition to be more bold and approach people that I thought I associated with, and it's as simple as that. If you have to feel aligned to the commitments of your clients, let's say in this case, and then it's simple. It's not simple, but you have some expertise. You offer them that, and it's just like any other relationship. It's based on the fact that you can actually provide some insights, and that you in fact agree with this group of people who are after the same kinds of goals and interests that you are.
Thank you.
I love the question, and I look where it's going. There's a number of our colleagues who teach the social sciences who would answer your question a different way. And you can Google this if you don't know the answer. Bounce a ball. Have you used that in any of your classes? Bounce a ball. Kim DaCosta, one of our colleagues. Bounce a ball. There's a question back here. How do you get people to pay attention, to know what you're up to want to be involved with you? Bounce a ball. It's a long, beautiful essay.
Hi, my name is April. I want to go back to universities as systems and really get to this granular level, and it's open to all the panelists. You see this dynamic of power structure within the classroom and the culture of architecture, of what is celebrated as successful student, what is othered and devalued. And it reinforces this hierarchy that is completely devoid of humanism and empathy. And I just would like to hear what are the rebellious actions within the classroom of architecture that can take place, that is not just projects going into the South Bronx, and I'm from the Bronx, but also it's a culture that's cultivated within these spaces that really, again, create the very dynamic we're purporting to fight against and deconstruct.
Great question. Do you mind giving us a little bit more context? Are you a recent graduate? Are you a professor yourself?
I'm a first-year MArch student at Spitzer School of Architecture.
At the Spitzer School of Architecture.
And I've been in both spaces. I've been at a very quote-unquote elite design program
Yes.
for my master's in
Yes.
design, and now I'm doing my architecture. And despite the difference in what you would perceive having the Max Bond Center, what I am witnessing is really disturbing in the field of architecture.
And I think that the question I have, too, about this is about how our educational processes, how we replicate ourselves, how, in fact, we are restating, embodying the power structure, that the very one that we're trying to come against. Panelists?
I guess I should answer this one. I think what you bring up is really true. It's the culture of architecture. I don't want to. We're sort of talking about rebel architecture, as in architecture that goes against the grain, and so there's too little of it so far, right? That's one of the issues at stake here, and the culture of architecture, as Louise rightly pointed out, is very much still, it's a, I want to state the obvious, white, male-dominated field. You'll go into an office and you will find, similar kinds of situations that you're confronted with. Within our school, it's true, we promote, we're sort of the least expensive architecture school, I believe, in the whole country at this point, with Cooper Union starting to, have some tuition. And so we have these aspirations. We have the Max Bond Center. Max Bond, he was an architect, a very successful African-American architect in New York City, and he created this endowment within our school, which is supposedly supposed to create social justice and equity within the city of New York. So it's a kind of a pilot program attached to the architecture school. However, it's very difficult to get everyone on board with this program. So some people may be paying lip service to it. I feel the responsibility is equally with the students and the faculty. You know, you both have to be in concert and agreement to do it. I see some of my students here, sitting over there, and they were very proactive students. You know, they kind of ran the Max Bond Center themselves because there was a kind of a break in leadership. So I think there's a lot of possibility, but there's also a lot of resistance to change.
Want to pick that up?
I mean, one thing that I've been looking at recently a lot is the idea that so many of these kind of, so much of the exploitation and discrimination that is obviously rampant in architecture is kind of inscribed in these series of performances that architects are forced to do. So for one, there's the performance of the crit, and I didn't go to architectural design school, but I have been on some crits, and it's horrifying. You have to present as a confident, able person after you haven't slept for 2 weeks, and you're like so insecure about what you produced. And there's absolutely no room for expressing vulnerability. There's like an effective environment that prescribes and assumes the confidence that really very few people have except for cis hetero white men. And so I think that's one obvious one, but it also, it's even more kind of granular to the point where, like, clothes, the fact that architects wear all black is a legacy of Adolf Loos's deeply racist and homophobic writing. So we have to analyze. I'm wearing black. But I mean, if we start analyzing these performances, this not sleeping is another huge one. It's like you don't actually have to stay up all night to get the work done. You can go to sleep and the work will probably be better, and you'll probably be able to defend it better, I think. But we perform it because, you know, if you haven't slept, you're a better architecture student. I think a means of resistance to that would be to slack off a little bit, to wear colors, to express vulnerability in the crit. But what that requires is people who are in power to forge alliances. You know, like, professors have to forge alliances with their students, and I don't see that happening very often, especially with like questions around unionization of graduate students, for example.
One thing that I think that is everything, I agree with this. Again, this is my 26th consecutive year to teach at the university level, but I left teaching professional architecture students in 2010 precisely because I thought there were certain very positive aspects about an architectural education and the studio culture that I thought could travel, but also the fact that architects are very good at talking to each other, that if we care about the built environment or the environment in general, which is absolutely, we don't get that choice, we have to care now. This is it. There's no planet B. This is it. If you look at the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, Philip, I hope it's okay to say, I think you authored the most recent paper under Goal 11 that we were able to read before tonight. But this is it. The one thing I think that I take very positively is the idea of the studio discourse between the professor, not the presentation part, but the idea of how we develop ideas without any right answers. There's an idea about speculation and innovation and going in with a sense of risk-taking, like we don't know where it's going to go, right? So there's something that now gets co-opted by the business community called design thinking. Well, as architects, it's actually what we've been doing all along. And no, we didn't write a book about it, and no, we didn't start the D School at Stanford with all the money we made from it. but it is something about this iterative process, about being incremental, about working with people in a group, usually in a pretty tight space, about sharing ideas, and then bringing them forward for discussion. So for me, it's that process itself that I think we've become effective in terms of our community work too. It's like, you're right, it's about listening, it's about walking the walk, knocking on the doors, taking pictures. Hey, what are you doing? Answer. Don't say, oh, don't mind me, don't mind, I'm just leaving now. No, you answer. I'm taking photographs. I'm a student. Right? So I think there's something that, I understand the frustration, but I also think don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. There's something about this, but I'm saying, but all of us, I think there's something so intense and productive about that moment of not knowing and finding out as a group and sharing information that does come out of the architecture schools. We're going to take one more final question. Who's that? Over here. You're on.
Good evening, and thank you for all the presentations. We can maybe end on a practical thought exercise. Lima, Peru has an enormous golf club in the middle of the city. It's sort of, if you imagine from here to Union Square being a private golf club instead of public space. If you were part of the community there, you know, right now there's a Facebook group that's organized from people in the community to try and make that public space. But if you were to arrive there, or if you were already living there and you're part of the community, what would be some of the first things that you would do to try and turn this golf club into public space?
Philip, do you mind if I call on you first for that one? Okay, he minds, but he's good.
I work at UN, I don't have practical answers. No, that's a joke. Look, I mean, I go back again to, it's an indicator of something that is fundamentally wrong in that place in terms of the inequalities that are there and the use of space. And so if I would have to go in myself, I would bring it back first to that kind of fundamental discussion on access to, and then mapping out who has what, and then starting to negotiate what are the options to deal with it. And it might not be next door. It might be somewhere else. And again, that discussion on the commons, I think, is very important.
Can you see? Oh, okay.
I reject the question. And I'm not saying it in a joking manner. The first thing I said was, we don't know everything. I've never been to Peru. How can I propose a solution to a place I've never been to, or an area that I didn't know existed, or a Facebook group that I don't have Facebook to look at the comments? So a practical answer would be, I can't answer that question. And I think this assumption, and again, like, you guys have to break this line of thinking, that you could just solve everything. Like, you can't. I know that's sobering to hear, but you can't. Somebody else can. It might not be you. It might not be one of us 4 or 5 that's up here. But just to, like, throw these things out there, or the design problem of, here's an empty lot, solve it. It's more nuanced than that. It's more intersectional than that. There's more tiny, like, really, really insular things that happen that we don't have all the answers or access or information about. So, I mean, for all we know, maybe that golf club does a lot of good in the area that from the outside we say, oh, it's a golf club, get rid of it. It might be the only source of income for half the people that are around there, because that's the means that they use to make money. I don't know. Only thing I know about Peru is sheep or llamas. I think it's llamas. Like, that's it.
I think you don't know. I think I would go with I don't know. But one of the things I think about, in a way to enter the question, and rejection is a perfectly fine thing too, is the fact that we are organizing more and more digitally, right? We're organizing information, we're organizing events and activists. So when is it fine to organize a protest via social media versus that has a time and space, that is a duration that is much shorter than land management issues that doesn't actually, what questions are you asking versus what does that not allow you to ask? So I actually think I'd like to interrogate the tool before I decide and know what that tool is good at versus what it is to be on the ground, to have information, to live somewhere and something like that. But I don't know if others would say something differently.
I'm with Jermaine. I think it's really a tricky question. Also, I just feel I want to caution us against, we've been through a lot of utopian thinking and these sort of large-scale utopian projects done in abstraction. And while they're interesting on some level, to look at, and they're part of our history and legacy of our profession, we have to address our own profession also in terms of its own history and what we've accomplished and where we are at the moment. So some question like that really sends me back to some of those other kinds of, mega city, large-scale intervention projects. And I would just say we've been through that. What do we want to do now? We're not at that same moment in time. However, if all the residents around there, want to take non-violent direct action, that would be fun. That would be the way to. I don't understand what else one could do in that situation, but sort of bum rush the golf course, right?
I like the idea of bum rushing. And I think, anatomically speaking, Nicholas, you've brought that to us as well. So with that, I will thank our panel for I want to thank Alejandro Velasco and Rebecca Amato of the Urban Democracy Lab, Angie, who manages everything in this room that we see, and of course to our dean, Suzanne Wofford, for making Gallatin a space where we can talk about rebelling. So have a good night, proceed with rebelling, and thank you very much for coming.